Lambert, who has come here straight from Doha. Laurent is a non-resident fellow at Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. Laurent is also an associate professor there, in charge of the courses in energy policy and sustainability. But for this small research community that I belong to, Laurent is mostly known for his article about genocide and ecocide in Gaza, which he will summarize here in this talk. Laurent worked as Research and Development Director at Oxford Concilium and Oxford Europeum.
Yes.
Europeum.
Which is related to the Central European University.
Yeah. Also, it's the same sponsor. Under the same sponsor and much more. I actually know this organization. Over the past 15 years, Laurent worked as a research and lead principal investigator and government advisor with the United Nations, the African Union, the French Ministry of Defense, and other such organizations. Laurent has published several research articles. Is there a book? The book. Tell us about it.
Well, one of them is what is called the Post-American Middle East, How the War on Terror Failed and Transformed the Middle East. And the other is about post-conflict in the Middle East and Africa. So very different situations, but interesting similar features.
Also, Dr. Lambert is contributing a chapter to our perspective volume called War and the Anthropocene. That I'm collaborating with Professor Dirk Moses, and we've been working together on this chapter. Okay, Laurent, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Thank you, Ivan, Akos, and everyone who's made this invitation, and the logistics very pleasant. By the way, I'm delighted to be back to this beautiful country. I have to say, the first time I came, probably I will stand around here. The first time I came to this beautiful country, Australia, was 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, it was right after the Paris Agreement on climate change. So I was invited by the United Nations as a board member of a UN body in charge of facilitating what is called clean technology transfer. Basically having the richest countries help poorer countries to develop with clean technologies. So avoiding the coal power plants and all these problematic technologies, and to get into more solar, wind, waste to fuel energy, etc. And I just mentioned this because 10 years ago, there was a lot of optimism. We were invited in, again, Vienna, and the government welcomed us. Then we went with UNIDO, so a development, industrial development organization within the United Nations, and we were working on making it happen. But we have to say that 10 years after, although a lot has been done, we are quite disappointed with the outcome, and we are even more disappointed by the perspective. So I just mentioned this briefly before, but we are in a situation where, in terms of environmental degradation globally, we have a very big concern. We have every year, and I will get into the proper presentation in a minute, but I want to set the scene first. We have every year a global issue of resources being exhausted very rapidly, and then global population living on what we call a debt, meaning we overconsume out of nature resources, if you want. So in very concrete terms, we have countries at the global scale, there are exceptions, but most countries will consume more water than is naturally replenished by overpumping their underground water resources. And this is true also with forestry. More trees in some places, not everywhere, but in many places, more trees are chopped down than are growing naturally. Of course, there are big differences. Brazil is not the same as Australia, very clearly, but overall, they're very bad indicators. And in this broad context, it's important to see the role of war. War nearly always has a very negative effect on the environment. But very often, this is seen as a secondary kind of issue or tertiary kind of issue at best. Sometimes it's not even in the picture. And we can understand why. You know, when people are dying in the thousands or in the hundreds of thousands or forcibly displaced in the millions, caring about the environment can be seen as, you know, something for the rich who have nothing else to consider. Yet the problem, as we will see during this presentation, is when the environment is absolutely necessary for survival. And when this disappears, or worse, when it is targeted, then survival is made less possible. So, thank you again for the invitation, and let's start now. I think this is the clicker. So in this introduction, I wanted to say that it's important to go beyond the death tolls, beyond the genocidal statements. This is important, but as we will see, there is quite a lot of literature about that. In the case of Gaza or in other cases, Sudan is very important these days. There are also big crimes committed in Ukraine, DC Congo, and other places. But if we focus on the case of Gaza as a case study, then we find that we have quite a lot of literature on the death tolls, genocidal statements, conclusions. But here we want to focus on what is the role, or what has been actually, what was the role, I will read the question instead of reformulating it. What role has the process of ecocide played in the genocidal process? So of course, such a question has an assumption, there is a genocidal process. That's what we will see first when we go through basically what is widely documented as a sort of literature overview, but as you will see, it's quite substantial. And we will focus on this research question with this focus, the human security as an analytical framework or conceptual framework. This is the structure of the presentation that I will go through. So again, what is widely documented, I will not go extensively into it because we would spend a lot of time. There are resources. I will show you a few ones that you can explore if you want to go deeper into this. More importantly, I will highlight a number of concepts for this study which links things which are separated generally. By the way, the added value of this study is about linking things which generally are kept apart. Because I have to link a number of things, there is quite a number of slides, so I have used some infographies more than usual to go through the points more rapidly. Then we'll speak about the compounding factors of ecocide as genocide and then provide some elements of conclusions. So what is already well documented? Well, first, we have an official and now double official toll of violent death, which is superior to 70,000 in Gaza. This comes from initially the Ministry of Health of Gaza, run by Hamas, an Islamist political group, but which not long ago was confirmed by the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, or the Israeli military, if you prefer. So this is the official violent death. Violent death means you've been killed by a bomb, a sniper bullet, a drone, or something of that kind. But of course, in war, there are all the indirect death, which sometimes it's much more numerous. So there has been several key academic studies made not long ago which have revealed that in a number of wars over the past 30 years, which is what I work on, by the way, the recent modern wars, you have for each direct or violent death up to 4 indirect deaths. So that's up to 4. I'm not saying this is the case in Gaza. Yet there are several studies, including one published not long ago, which will appear again. By the way, you will find footnotes every time I speak, and if you want, the slides will be made available, which said that this death toll seems underestimated by 35 to 40%. And this is based on land surveys, meaning people went there, spoke to the families, who are your relatives, when did they disappear, etc. Now you may say, why would have the government in place minimized the number of deaths? Briefly, the number of deaths here comes from having a hospital or a morgue or a clinic that takes the ID number and the name, and of course has all the information, and then it's registered in the governmental apparatus, if you want. So there is someone in the Ministry of Health that needs to centralize all the information. The only problem is that when you have mass destruction, you have less hospitals, less access to clinics, less access to morgues. At the end of the day, the number of deaths is less registered. And we have cases of people who were, for instance, in the north of Gaza, couldn't go down because they were afraid of snipers. And when they had people who were dead at home, either direct or indirect death, they buried them in the garden. By the way, this happens during almost each and every war. So unrecorded death is an issue. So what we know is that the final death toll that will emerge in the years to come, and we have now 4 very serious independent studies which have been made, all of them indicate that the death toll is above 100,000 deaths. Again, direct, meaning violent, or indirect. By the way, about indirect death, it's very often related to people not having access to the health system. So let's imagine if you're diabetic, if you have cancer, if you need a dialysis, and this is stopped during a few weeks or months, you're very likely to die. So this is what is often the case. Oh, no, sorry, that's this one. But if we go a bit further into detail, and we won't spend too much time on it, but I want to highlight this. During the first few months, there was already something which was saying something is going wrong. On the right side, you have, during the first period, you have, so October 2023 to February 2024, you had the number of children killed. And then on the left, you had all the world wars children died over 4 years before. So all the conflicts, Sudan, Yemen, Ukraine, etc., all of them are in each of these 4 years, yet in 6 months in Gaza, you had more children dead than in these 4 years of global data of children killed. And this comes from the United Nations, the UNICEF, actually, which has investigated that a lot. So something seemed off in terms of civilian death. This led to condemnations by a number of organizations, so Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, which is the leading human rights NGO in Israel, several other Israeli and international organizations, the United Nations published about that. With regards to genocide, the Lemkin Institute is one of the most important organizations. So there are some others, but these are, if you want, the core of the international system we have in terms of having the expertise. Well, I'm sorry, some of the names are still in French. I did not translate them. But you can see overall that this is not just a 1 or 2 rogue organizations which decided to say, yes, it's a genocide. No, there were investigations. The United Nations commissions stated Israel has committed genocide in the Gaza Strip. The International Criminal Court established arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu, his Minister of Defense, and 3 Hamas officials, but they've been killed, so this has been retracted. The International Court of Justice is processing the thing and should, by roughly 27, provide its opinion. It always takes many years to provide an opinion as to whether there is genocide or not for the International Court of Justice. Yet it's important to highlight that they placed an order on the state of Israel, which generally indicates that they believe something very wrong is ongoing, and the orders are there to say, hold on, you need to stop doing this, stop doing that, and stop doing this. In that case, enabling much more aid to enter the Gaza Strip. So this is something worth mentioning. Now, as you probably know, for a genocide to happen, you need to have a genocidal intent, meaning the state has the intention to mass murder or to forcibly displace or to create different genocidal acts with this specific intention. And so we have here the kind of statements, and there are thousands of them. I will just highlight a few more, but you can see the nature of these things. Dehumanization, very often, is part of the genocidal process. So we are fighting human animals. We will eliminate everything. This is the Minister of Defense. We have plenty for other ministers, but also for military officers and field soldiers. As you can see here, this is coming from the article, the paper I prepared and that Alexander referred to. So you can take any of them. Let's say this senior commander, no mercy to the wrongdoers and their families. So we see it's not about targeting Hamas and their partners. You can take any of these. For the sake of time, I'll take a small one. Well, we can take this. Yoav Gallant, Minister of Defense, we will eliminate everything. If it doesn't take one day, it will take a week. If it takes weeks or even months, we will reach all places. And we have some more. The Minister of Education saying, those are animals, they have no right to exist. I am not debating the way it will happen. They need to be exterminated. So this is genocidal language. And there are many, many publications about that available. And so I will not spend time on this. I will focus this study more on these notions that we will use to see how the environment can be part of a process of mass murdering and forcible displacement. So let's talk about the weaponization, meaning transforming into a weapon something which normally is not. The weaponization of the environment in a human security perspective, which is something quite specific. So what is a human security perspective? Well, it's a holistic approach to a society's security based on key pillars, and we will see an example. Humans should be, in this approach, placed at the center. Security in this approach is not for the state first and foremost, but for the society. And this is an important paradigmatic shift, because until the late 1990s, almost everything was made for the security of the state. And we Europeans, we know very well how much our countries were capable of massacring each other with millions of deaths on each side just for the state to prevail. I think I'm French. My country, for the sake of two small regions shared, not shared precisely, close to Germany, we went to 2 world wars with Germany, and in total making more than 12 million deaths, for the sake of the state taking over regions. So, a long story made short, this human security approach is a very different paradigm, where we try to put at the very center the population. And this is important. Now, it calls, and this is coming from a UN General Assembly resolution, for people-centered, comprehensive context-specific, so not a one-size-fits-all, and prevention-oriented responses that strengthen the protection and empowerment of all people. So the UN generally has nice-sounding words and terms, but in this case, this came from mainly two scholars, Nobel laureate Amartya Sen from India and Mahbub Haq from Pakistan, who was working for the World Bank. And they came up with these concepts of investing in the populations because they believe that education and capacities are fundamental for freedom and justice and the development of a society, and that these should be at the core of the state activities. Good. Now, this, of course, human security perspective can serve as a conceptual framework to analyze the interconnectivities, so the way it exchanges, the way it interacts with, in the different pillars, as we will see. It will be very clear with the picture. And how we can analyze also potential compounded effects of grave threats, risks, and attacks on the people. So this can be analyzed in Ukraine, in Sudan, in Congo, and in this case, in Gaza. But before that, let's see this. In human security perspective, you have different pillars. By the way, you may have different ones for different countries. And what it means is that we don't look at food security as something just detached from, let's say, community security, or community security being detached from environmental security. This is important to say because most governments work with different ministries, which very often work in silos. There is a huge literature in public administration and public policy about that. The fact that ministers and directors and managers create their small fiefdoms and protect them with vested interests for not sharing information, for not letting others get, rewarded for what they do in their own administration. So a tradition of silos in modern states. And this really goes against it. The idea is that there should be collaborations, not just exchange of data, but ideally creating synergies, right? That ministries work together so that the food security and the health security go hand in hand. And maybe they do common investments in programs. It can be education programs, it can be food affordability programs, but they tend to work together. This approach is very important. It's very spoken about, but in the reality, it's much harder to put in place. Yet this is what it tends to promote, the human security framework. And of course, as a conceptual framework, the human insecurity highlights the fact that when some are under attack, all of them, because they are interactive, may be under attack. And in the case of a conflict, when there is environmental destruction, when there is forced displacement and starvation, you have, of course, exponential mortality. It's very simple to understand that if you have to flee a place and that the other places where you will go are also under siege and that there are restrictions for food, there will be tensions and there will be people suffering to a greater extent, and this will create compounding effects with greater health issues, communicable diseases spreading, etc., etc. Now, I just say some words about scorched earth policy versus ecocide. Scorched earth policy is something that happens a lot during wars. Scorched earth policy is about making sure your enemy, who need to be combatant enemies, do not have access to food or other resources. So this comes from the field of military strategy, while ecocide is very different. So let's speak a bit more about ecocide. Ecocide is an environmental crime. So while one is about targeting resources denials against military or armed enemies, can be terror groups. Ecocide is very different because this is the systemic, so you attack the system. Ecological destruction, which then affects indiscriminately all living forms. So while the first one is about making sure that there is not food available or other resources, it can be energy resources, to the enemy, the second one is about making sure that we destroy in depth and for the long term the ecosystem. So when you want to make sure that an enemy doesn't have something, you can, make sure that there is no food and that some warehouses of food can be burnt. This can happen during war, and you cannot necessarily say this is a war crime, because if these are warehouses where food for combatants are stored, this is actually within the framework of international law. However, when you do so with all the resources available indiscriminately, then this is a war crime. And in the case of ecocide, this involves also destroying, for instance, agricultural fields. And in some cases, uprooting trees. In some cases, spreading long-term fungicides, insecticides, and other things which will neutralize the soils for years and sometimes decades to come. So this is an ecocide. So there are many ecocides in history. Saddam Hussein was a dictator in the 1990s, especially in the 80s, but also in the 1990s in Iraq, punished the minority of Shiite Muslims in the south by making dams to dry the wetlands of the south of Iraq. And the whole population in the south of Iraq, which had depended for millennia on wetlands for their survival, then were found unemployed because they didn't know how to fish, etc. I mean, there was no fish available. The land had become dried. And they were without a house because their housing system was dependent on the reeds coming from these wetlands. They were eventually forcibly displaced because they could not live in the south. So this was a way to kill an ecosystem to punish the population depending on it. So this is one example, but we have many other ones. I will show you very briefly a few ones. And in terms of law, the first one again is highly regulated by existing laws for war. So it can be on a basis to basis legal or not, but the second one is absolutely not legal. And there is an increasing amount of legal statements, rulings coming from the ICJ, for instance, expert opinions, which lead to everyone anticipating that there will be now clear laws about ecocides in the years to come. We don't know yet when exactly, but we know that in 2025, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, ruled about environmental crimes. So there is some progress being made on this. Here are just a few cases of ecocides that you can use to understand the logic. In the US, the idea was that to be able to subjugate the local native population that some called Amerindians, but they would not call themselves this way, but the population which had been living for centuries in what had become the United States, there was a mass slaughtering of more than 40 million bisons, because this was a key element in the survival strategy and in the food system of the local populations. So by eliminating this, you completely transformed the ecosystem where they had been living, and you made them having to flee to other places. Or, because they fled a number of times, eventually they had to sign a deal with the government of the United States to be able to receive some food supplies in exchange of renouncing all their rights in the Great Plains, where they had been living for centuries. So this was a way to subjugate a population. We have in Vietnam, so some people may say the war in Vietnam with the US was not a settler-colonial warfare. Yes, it was, because it started with the French, and we should not be proud of it, because it used to be part of the French Empire. But when the French left, defeated, 1954, the Dien Bien Phu was one of the battles that we definitely lost. What happened afterwards is that we left, but the Americans thought, okay, where the French lost, we will prevail. And even if the French government said, you know, this is a liberation war, you are very unlikely to win this war, the Americans thought, we will change the game. And that involved a number of things. First, bombing the countries nearby, so Laos, Cambodia, for instance, but also destroying the ecosystem in which the guerrilla was waged. So you had large trees with canopy which was thick enough for guerrilla fighters of Vietnam to hide and not to be seen by helicopters or planes. And so they were using it. So the Americans, understanding it, spread what was called orange agents, which is something which used to destroy, to defoliate, so meaning destroying the canopy, so the forest cover. But this was also the food system of the local populations. And finally, there is Gaza, where we will see that the environment being destroyed is part and parcel of the strategy, the genocidal strategy. By the way, in most cases, when you have an ecocide, you want to exhaust a population. You know, you create more stress than the person can take, especially because you exhaust their resources, so you exhaust the population. This is important to understand the idea of multiple stressors and exhaustion. Exhaustion also because people are very often forcibly displaced. So this is in Gaza, but we have seen pictures of people being forcibly displaced in many countries. Again, it can be Ukraine or Sudan or other places. And one key thing I would like to read, which comes from the health sciences, is this extract from an article from colleagues. Environmental stressors often co-occur, creating multi-hazard scenarios that can have synergistic or cumulative impacts on human health. For example, exposure to air and noise pollution can increase respiratory and cardiovascular disease risk. Why do I mention this? Because it's very important to understand that the population may resist one kind of stress or another kind of stress. But when the two happen at the same time, these can be overwhelming for the coping capacities of a population. By the way, in the field of ecology, this is very well known. I give you this quick example. In the Red Sea, when there is a heat wave, corals, which are a key ecosystem, bleach for a part of them. Yet, overall, the corals survive. But when you have an oil spill, a part of it will bleach, which means die, by the way, for corals, but the rest will survive. But when you have a heat wave and an oil spill, even not a major one, then the devastation is huge, because the amount of stress for these species is beyond their coping capacities. So this is very important. So now, to put it in a nutshell, we can have mass mortality out of three different things which come together, very often one pushing the other, but sometimes they come separately. And this is what we want to understand, a multiplier effect. So let's take the case of Gaza. So the first week we had 6,000 bombs dropped, leading to some cities, so after, of course, the first week, but over time, the amount of destruction was huge. You can see it on this satellite imagery. But I just want to put into context 6,000 bombs in the first week. That's roughly a bomb every minute and a half, night and day, every day. I don't know if any one of you has lived anywhere where bombs are dropped. Kilometers away, you hear it. Kilometers away, you hear it. I can tell you. So, and you hear it as if it's next door, by the way, sometimes. So last time a bomb exploded not far from where I was, it was 4 or 5 kilometers. I thought these were people using guns in the street down my building. But no, this was kilometers away. And this was in Doha. By the way, the Israelis last summer decided to bomb. And this was 4 or 5 kilometers from where I was. You had in this bombing, and I will not spend too much time on these military items, but you had some bombs which were 2,000 pounds, which means 1,000 kilos, used in densely crowded places. So a very destructive approach. But more importantly here, you had 37 million tons of toxic debris. So when you destroy a city, there is not just the explosion, there is not just the direct death, there is the matter of the smoke, the noise, there is the matter of the air being polluted, sometimes for days, because goes in the air construction materials which were never supposed to go into the air. So this is very likely to be a building that follows European standards of construction. So in itself, it must be safe, must be safe. Here and there, we can find probably a few things which are of concern, but overall, it's safe. You're not going to die in the weeks or months to come because you've been in this room. However, if there is careless destruction of the place and some of the construction materials go into the air, then this becomes highly toxic. And this is why people working in the construction and deconstruction wear masks, because there are dust which can go deep into your respiratory system and kill you and generate cancer for many of them. So there is a huge matter of toxicity, but there is also the matter of the transformation of the cities into what many people called non-places. So non-place is initially a concept coming from philosophy about these places which are all the same, so they have no quality of their own. Like you go to a McDonald's in an airport, you could be in Kuala Lumpur or you could be in Berlin, in, I don't know, South Africa or Colombia, they look the same. So some philosophers call this non-places. But there is another dimension to non-places, it's these places which have been destroyed. And then these cities, which may have centuries of millennia of age, then have no characteristics of their own. They are just rubble, sheer destruction. There is not this street with this history anymore, not this building with this specific history anymore. And by the way, in Gaza, from Alexander the Conqueror to Che Guevara going in 1962 to Gaza, there is quite a lot of history which has been erased. I'm pretty proud to be French because last summer my government organized something on the 5,000 years of history of Gaza. 5,000 years. And if you want to know the first, most well-known population living in Gaza, you go into a Bible and you read about the Philistines. The Philistines had as a capital city Gaza. And I'm not going to speak about the Bible, but Abraham comes and finds that the Philistines are already there. So quite a place with history. I will skip you this for the sake of time, but again, the pattern is very, very important. In a war, when you have 60% of all buildings destroyed or damaged within 6 months, that means the intensity was very, very strong, but also that there was no segregation between combatants and non-combatants. Because you cannot have combatants in 60% of all the buildings, especially when the combatants were estimated at the beginning of the war to be 30,000 out of a population of 2.3 million. So they are a small minority. You cannot destroy legally 60% of all buildings. A second mechanism of destruction was the agricultural ecocide. Agriculture is a form of ecosystem. You don't have just natural ecosystems. You have also agricultural ecosystems, urban ecosystems, and in this case, the agricultural ecosystems were erased, sorry. So out of a year and a half of war, you had in August 2025 only 1.5% of agricultural land which remained either non-destroyed and accessible. The rest was either fully destroyed or kept by the Israeli military. So then you ask the question, how can the people feed themselves? Especially as they are under a land siege and naval blockade. This is yet another picture showing that the agricultural land has been destroyed and the underground water resources have been destroyed, with the IDF going to great length to salinize the underground water resources. Speaking of water, a third mechanism was the weaponization of water and sanitation. So when I worked back in the days as a humanitarian, I used to work in water and sanitation as a sector. It's called WATSAN or WASH, depending on the organization. And here what we see is an intentional destruction of all the water infrastructure. So all the desalination plants, all were destroyed, including with IDF soldiers filming themselves doing so. So in the ICC and the ICJ, they not only have the names, they have also the videos, which some of them can be found still online on YouTube. Being happy to show how they destroyed it. The problem is that not only there is less fresh water accessible, but then the problem is that you have a huge amount of sewage effluent going throughout the city. And this is a major issue because it's contaminating everything. The soils, it's contaminating also the minimum underground water resources still available. So this is a huge, huge issue. And this generates what? This generates communicable diseases. So cholera outbreaks emerged. By the way, I still fail to understand how you reduce the capacities of your enemy by destroying this. A fourth mechanism was forced displacements. So within 2 months, 85% of the population in Gaza was forcibly displaced. And now, after more than 2 years, all the population has been displaced, including people who have been displaced more than 10 times. Now, the people move with their families. Now, the blockade makes the access to vehicle fuels very expensive. So how do you move a whole family, including the elderly and the children, when in the middle of the night you receive an evacuation order? When you receive one. So this has led to a psychology of extreme levels of stress. And this has led to forced exhaustion of populations because they had to walk dozens of kilometers sometimes, carrying all what they could, including their children, sometimes their parents, to be able to just survive, without necessarily knowing where exactly would be safe, because the flyers have a resolution at this scale. So if you look this map, you're unable to see which street is where. There's not resolution good enough. So when you receive a flyer in the middle of the night, which has a resolution that makes impossible for you to know which street will be safe or not, you go into the unknown. Because it's not that the resolution says this street will be safe, this street will be unsafe. It just gives big areas. And you have to guess by when you reach the other area. The fifth mechanism has been the engineered starvation. So vast undernourishment was used. And by the way, for the short story, at the beginning I was quite annoyed when the first scholar of genocide studies, who is an Israeli Jewish scholar, Ras Siegel, mentioned the genocide. Because in my family, there had been people deported in concentration camps during World War II. And so, you know, you don't joke with this, genocide. But the thing is that when I saw what was being made with the food, this rang the bell of what my uncle experienced in Buchenwald concentration camp, which is that there was a lot of attention in terms of propaganda made to say, oh, they are well treated, etc. My uncle had to write to my family about the good treatment, etc. in the concentration camp. However, the reality was vastly different. And here in this case, we have a lot of authorities that say, no, they have a lot of food, actually they are getting fat. While all the documentation showed this, including, so the vast deprivation, including Israeli documents that's recognized, so Kogat is the Israeli authority in charge of bringing the food, and alleging that, yes, during some months, 0 trucks. No food. That's from Kogat. By the way, this was eventually published by The Guardian, but based on Kogat figures, and sometimes 32% of the minimum requirements. And that's where to me, it reminded me this classic thing that you don't completely cut the food for months to make sure they all die in one round. You make them underfed over time, and they will die. This is a mechanism that we can see across things. So I'm almost done. So please, let's see now, discuss a bit what we have seen. So the destruction of Gaza transcends scorched earth tactics. It goes beyond. It represents a deliberate strategy of ecocide. We destroyed the urban environment, we destroyed the agricultural environment, and the little of the natural environment, but the agricultural environment, all of that is eradicated. There's no resource made available. And this is a mechanism of genocide. And this is a mechanism of genocide that we can link to this Article 2C of the Genocide Convention about deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction. So the people will not have enough food. They don't die again very rapidly, but they keep on exhausting all the coping mechanisms that they have. Actually, the body, when underfed, will start eating its proteins, meaning its muscles, up until it cannot, and the people die. And this is why we have these, so I will skip the details. We saw that there was this multi-stress genocidal mechanism. Starvation, diseases, especially when the sewage system is destroyed on purpose, then exhaustion, then trauma, rapid immune system collapses, and then what goes again? Disease. There is a sort of, we'll call it in science, positive feedback loop. It's not positive at all. It just means that one mechanism will reinforce another mechanism, etc. Unfortunately, in this kind of case, this leads to greater death toll, a compounding effect leading to excess mortality. I have 2-3 slides, almost done. When we see the conflict through the human security lens, we see that several systems were directly targeted, but eventually it contaminated the whole human security. There's no pillar left unaffected in Gaza. The traditional lens would have been state-centered. We would have studied what was happening in Gaza just via the borders, the matter of sovereignty and the military targets and death, etc. This would have been just a classic but superficial line of analysis. Instead, when you go through the human security lens, you have a people-centered approach, and then you deal more with survival capacity. Can the people endure all what they went through? Can the people live with the amount of calories that were let in, even if you take the Israeli figures? The answer you could see. The dignity, gone. And the interconnectivity, again, showed that all of this was affected. And the failure, so the failure to abide by the Genocide Convention that the State of Israel signed, is that Israel, in its strategy, systematically dismantled these pillars simultaneously. So all of them have been targeted. There was no capacity to differentiate, which was used in the bombing, so that what is for civilian populations remains protected at all. I finish with that. 2 slides, I guess. This is, again, the key element that we need to focus on from the Genocide Convention, the conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction. This is what we've seen. So again, with the siege, ecocide, health sector annihilation, all hospitals have been targeted, some fully destroyed, some partly destroyed. There is a growing consensus about the plausible risk of genocide, some having already asked for arrest warrants. And in terms of expert opinions, we have now all Jewish Israeli scholars in the field of genocide studies. All the leading scholars of Israel have said this is a genocide. Amos Goldberg, Aryeh Newer, Russ Siegel was the first one, Lee Mordechai, Omar Bartov, and many others. So this was a multidimensional genocide, and this was part of Israel's campaign to systematically attack every pillar of human security. Here, ecocide was not a collateral damage. Oh, we make war so the environment suffers. No. It was the central mechanism destroying the environment, the central mechanism of the genocidal process. In other words, ecocide has been the genocide. It has been at the core of it. We make sure the people cannot stay. We make sure the people cannot cope. We make sure that the people either die or leave. And we erase what is there. So Gaza has become a site of transformed ecology designed for death. You cannot live there. Everything is razed to the ground. There's no food system much. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Laurent. So, that's a very tough subject. So please, questions, comments, comparisons, whatever you wish to say. Yeah, please.
On the ecocide notion, you trace the ecocide thing back to the US versus bison tribe erosion, if I can say like this, in the 19th century. But although we have during history seen the use of flooding or the use of putting salt to erase environment, and I think about Carthage, that have long-term consequences on the environment to inflict damage to an opponent. Do those examples for you fall into that definition of ecocide, or is it something only applicable to the modern era, and if yes, why?
Thank you. It's a very good question. It's a very good and complex question. I'll start by the end. I don't apply ecocide just for the modern era. There's been thousands of years of ecocide, but they were different than we have at the current modern period. Because now we have engines which have such capacities that in a very limited amount of time, we can create destruction which will take decades or in some cases centuries to recover from. Up until now, Hiroshima and Nagasaki are not healthy places to live in, just to give an example. The reason why I mentioned the Great Plains is that this is one which is very documented and very easy to directly understand. You know, you erase the bisons and then the whole ecosystem becomes so difficult to survive for the people living there. I should have said the winters are very tough there. So if you don't have a good source of proteins, you can have a very, very hard time. But to go back to your questions, the salinization of soils as a weapon, or the flooding, sometimes by the destruction of a dam, can be also an ecocide, depending on the intention. Because in some cases, it's just to displace the population and it's temporary. And if the ecosystems are not damaged for the mid to long terms, it's hard to speak about an ecocide. But when this is realized and that there is this intention of destroying living ecosystems to punish a population or to attack or displace it, then yes, this is an ecocide. Thank you again for highlighting that it goes much further than the examples I have given. Thanks.
I was also thinking on a historical example. I was thinking on Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War. There is this passage when he describes how the Athenians and Spartans destroyed the forests to build the ships for attacking each other. And even though they regret doing this because they know it will bring consequences to themselves, to their own people, they still do this because they know that destroying the enemy or defeating it is more important than dealing with the long-term consequences of ecological damage. So in this case, not from the Palestinian perspective, but from the Israeli perspective, what are the considerations of these damages to their own security in this humanitarian holistic approach that you present?
Thank you. Very good example first and good question. With regards to what you have highlighted, this is all very often a problem, that when the ecosystem is nearby or directly there, its destruction for the sake of warfare is seen as, yes, this is a problem, but we have to do it. This happens a lot. By the way, in the case of Gaza, there is also this consideration by anyone who has some education in environmental matters in Israel, because Gaza is directly next to Israel. And Gaza and Israel are small. So Gaza from the top, the north, the border with Israel to the south is 40 kilometers. So it's very small. And so many people in Israel know that the toxic elements that go into the air because of the bombing will find their way somehow in Israel. So they will be themselves affected. It seems that 2 years after the beginning of the war, the population has a bit changed in attitude towards the war. This is classic, by the way, war fatigue, first and foremost. People have enough of the war, of having loved ones going to fight and so on and so forth. But with regards to the environment, there is also an understanding that this will not trigger anything good to have long-term contamination. Yet, and this can be a paradox, and societies are always paradoxical, because we don't necessarily take the time to think about all the aspects of our life and whether they are coherent. Yet in Israel, there is also a very state-encouraged desire to continue the war. This is a state-encouraged desire to continue the war. I should say a few things. The Prime Minister of Israel now, not the head of state, the Prime Minister of Israel is Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu is not just wanted for war crimes and crimes against humanity by the ICC. He's also under investigations, and there is a judgment, a trial for him for corruption and abuse of social affairs, etc. So he wants to have a long-lasting war. And the problem is that his government is pushing the idea that keeping the war ongoing is good. So the people in Israel, a great number of them start to really understand that we will pay a price. Economically, the country has never been as over-indebted. Environmentally, although this doesn't seem to be a high consideration. In terms of human, people just dying, in the war. Yet it doesn't seem to have, for now, been a high priority, the environment. I'm very afraid to say. But again, this is often the case. And this is why your generation is very important to change it, to change the importance given to environmental matters. Environmental matters are not just, these nice little things outside. They are where we live. We live in an urban environment. If it's not conducive to life, this can be conducive to death. If you have a place where air pollution is way too high, where depression is there, because if cities are not built well, you spend a lot of time commuting, not engaging with loved ones, etc. There are a lot of things to study about environment and how it can be or not conducive to life. And I think it's very important, again, for your generation to really understand this. Now, to go back to the matter of war, not accepting that everything is destroyed is very, very important. We should have clear guidelines. Even if the enemy is seen as an utter enemy, we should be able to always have clear guidelines and to be able to implement them.
It's very important also because most of the students in this class take the course of called war, post-war, memory of war. And the so-called rules of war and the idea of war crimes and the very applicability of law to war is, of course, a very tough and very heartbreaking subject. But you give fantastic examples, of course, how it works or does not work. Please, questions, comments here. Yeah, go on.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much. It's important to amplify the voice about this. Maybe I just have a more conceptual question on how the ecocide, as you're framing it, and the weaponization of nature is clearly more and more contemporary. A device of war, but a device of settler-colonialism, but a device that is working very well for these ventures of the war that are seen around the world. So I'm just wondering if there's a connection in terms of the long term with this slow violence that is instauration in these places, not only in the framework of a war, a very specific moment and so on and so forth, but little by little, by exhaustions of resources, like how's happening in Gaza. The water issue is not recent. This has been long-standing issue. So how this device is operating in other geographies, in other latitudes, toward different issues, extractivism and so on and so forth. But how it starts to be connected or clearly targeted by, amplifying what's behind of the project, what we're seeing through this ecocidal mechanism. I don't know if that's
Thank you. Yes. Well, I will give examples to answer to your question. The matter of ecocide can happen sometimes in times of peace, at least legally speaking. And I will give the example of the Amazon forest. So you have some communities of settlers in the Amazon forest who want the local populations to move, to be able to chop down the trees and clear the area and sell it for cattle, generally, for ranches to be able to exploit the land. So what they do is that they make the life of the local populations impossible. And via this example, I just would like to highlight the capacity of groups to really be creative and fortunately to find each and every way to make the life of others impossible. So in the Amazon forest, they may contaminate with mercury the freshwater resources, although this is generally not the most efficient system because in the Amazon forest you have access to a number of resources, freshwater resources, yet they use that. They have capacities to destroy some key areas where they know, let's say, the indigenous population comes to this place to take honey from the trees, etc. They will do this kind of thing. So to some extent, what I'm trying to highlight is that in times of peace, which are not necessarily contexts of peace, but legally speaking, times of peace, you can have the mapping, if you want, the intellectual mapping, the unofficial mapping of all what a population depends on to be able to stay and survive in a place by some groups to be able to, if not destroy a group, at least forcibly displace them. So I hope it answered a part of your question as to the capacity in some very different contexts to attack, these different aspects. And they really understand, these communities of people who live off the forest of the Amazon forest, razing the forest, erasing the forest, I should say. They really understand what these local communities, use for their economic system. What do they depend on in terms, again, of fresh water or land? When do they move, if they are semi-nomads, etc., to be able to destroy this system in a very organized manner. So, did I answer your question? Yeah? Okay.
Just about the systematicity that is just happening. Honestly, what came to my mind was Patagonia at this moment.
Yes.
Like,
Yeah.
A very clear, but a map of actors, very similar actors.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, just as I was normalizing a bit more and more the mechanism.
Yes.
As this is low violence on like exhaustions of resources,
Yes.
exploitations of resources, but like clearly as a
Yes.
way of displacement.
Yes. Fire, by the way, is indeed very widely used, not just in South America, but also in Southeast Asia, for instance, to clear the land, but also make sure that the populations who depend on the local ecosystems cannot do so anymore. So you start a fire that will clear the land and, again, at the same time, cut the population from its livelihood. So then the populations have to move. By the way, what is very interesting in an ecocide is that generally the end goal is not to kill each and every one, like, by the way, in many genocide, it's also the case. These are two different concepts, but what they share in common is more the idea of making life impossible so that either the people die or they have to leave if they want to survive. That's a key feature of ecocides. Of course, you have more minor ecocides, which are just about making sure that the other has a terrible life or terrible experience, or you have accidental ecocides. It's more rare, but that does happen. The USSR overpumped the Aral Sea, to grow cotton, to be able to export, and in the end, this whole ecosystem died. This was an ecocide. It was not made on purpose, but this was an ecocide.
This could be argued, so like, are there things that are
That's
accidental in this?
Okay.
area?
Right. That's the beauty of academia. We can debate it a lot.
Yeah, we could debate. Yeah, there are facts and
Okay.
counter arguments. There was a question somewhere.
You talked about, among other things, about the use of conventional heavy bombs and bulldozers and the destruction. And what we didn't talk about, and I was wondering about the role of advanced technologies like AI-driven targeting systems, cyber attacks on infrastructures, or sophisticated surveillance in enabling these ecocides. So I was wondering how might this use of 21st century military technology makes the current destruction of Gaza different or even more efficient than other historical examples like the use of Agent Orange.
Yeah, absolutely, very good question. So it's true, it's in the paper, by the way, but it's not in this presentation. I had to make choices, but it's very important to highlight that AI being used by the military now around the world increasingly, and in this case by the Israelis, has led to massive destruction, because also the way you program the AI will give you what you want. The AI is not human, it will not complain, it's just a tool, and if you are in a moment where you want, eradication of Hamas, let's think a minute, just, intellectual, science fiction. You have your ChatGPT made for your army, and at one moment, you write what you want. This, by the way, thought experiments are very important. They are made in Silicon Valley a lot to be able to think about how to program or not to program, including AI systems. Let's imagine you have your ChatGPT for your army. and you've just been attacked. And by the way, October 7 was a terrible attack. A lot of people were killed, including a lot of civilians. So you're under this pressure from your population, yourself, you're deeply hurt. And you write, find ways to eradicate Hamas. But you don't write without hurting civilians, because your priority is to eradicate Hamas. And what has happened with the AI is that it gave places where Hamas militants might be at the moment, statistically. And this is why we've seen so many places bombed, is that statistically they could be there, and they could also be there, and they could be there. And all of that was bombed. And this is what has become totally insane. Now, if we go into greater detail, there is a very good, it's a magazine, but it's world class. It has worked a lot with international, media, The Guardian, New York Times. It's called Plus 972, which is the, how do you call it? It's for the phone numbers abroad. So for Israel, you write Plus 972, then it's Israel. This is an Israeli magazine. And it is the one which has detailed the most how AI has been used to target, including civilians in Gaza. Because, again, of just the statistical possibility of having combatants there, the place was bombed. And so many places were bombed. And by the way, we are 2 years after, and Hamas is still there. I mean, let's think about how foolish it all was. This is a case study in what not to do. And to me and colleagues like mine who had worked, I mentioned a book I had written on the war on terror, led by the US, but not just the US. Some of the conclusions we had written, were, we thought, already quite known in at least the field of military studies, etc., and they seem not to have cared at all, such as targeting the head of a group will not stop the group if the incentives to stop the combat are not there, And again, what we saw, by the way, we saw it also with Venezuela. When Maduro was taken over, kidnapped, has the state of Venezuela collapsed? No. The same regime is in charge. The same regime still exploits the oil of Venezuela, and this has led to nothing. And this is a key issue in terms of war, but as you rightly highlighted, compounded by the fact that now we have AI, and AI has zero ethical capacity of its own. If you do not put it in, it will do just what you said and just what you asked. By the way, I finished with this thought experiment because this is very important. There are some people in the field of AI in the US who've highlighted that if you program AI without any restriction, like preserving life, preserving the environment, or minimum, etc., it will create answers that can be completely silly, but in some cases, criminal, such as how to stop pollution, and then it will come to, at a moment, the AI may say, we can reduce the population, because the population is correlated to the amount of pollution. Stopping or reducing the pollution can be done in very criminal manner. So we do live in a time where, for the sake of the Anthropocene, but the sake of humanity also surviving, we need to be able to work on these kind of issues. Yes.
There is a current debate in the United States, basically there's the news of these days, between the Anthropic, which makes Claude,
True.
and OpenAI, I think, which makes ChatGPT.
Yes.
And Anthropic does not provide its Claude to the Minister of War, as they are calling it
Yes.
now, while
Yes.
Chat is available for the Minister of War. And the main argument is that, argument for Anthropic is that AI, in war games, AI leads to unlimited escalation, to the absolute war, exactly. So there is nothing intrinsic in AI that would limit this war at some certain point, which is essential, of course,
Yes.
for survival of humanity. But but we'll see what will happen
very
to this
interesting.
with this debate. Yeah.
Yes. Literally, if we apply a human nature to AI is a psychopath. It has zero capacity of empathy. I'm not saying it's a serial killer necessarily, but it's a psychopath. It cannot say, no, sorry, this I won't recommend because that doesn't sound good and fair and so on. So this is a key concern of our time. Yeah.
How about political economy of this, of all this, like this war in Israel, war, the Russian war in Ukraine, or the case in Venezuela? We've been, I think, trained, through decades or through generations rather, that wars are about imperialism, about empire, about profit making. But in this contemporary wars, there is no profit that could be taken of it. There are, of course, like arms sellers, certain actors, individual actors. They, of course, are making money. And they should, because they have private businesses, whatever. But overall, all this operation is just, these countries that do it, they're losing billions or rather trillions.
Absolutely.
Even the United States, which kind of took Maduro, they cannot sell this, oceans of oil. Nobody buys it, like
yes.
nobody invests in that. So, but also the same Mr. Trump wants to build up the strip of Gaza, building whatever, like Miami Beach there, which probably will never happen, I think, for security reasons and things like that. Also, probably because of the pollution.
That's one. By the way, even if there had not been any massacre before that, just for the sake of the environment being definitely contaminated now, I wouldn't buy anything in Gaza for at least years, because the water, the air, the soils are deeply contaminated. Plus, you have thousands of unexploded ordnances, which some of them will be found in the years to come. My country, France, we keep on finding, German bombs, sometimes American bombs, but especially German bombs, in our forests, from World War II. So think about how many there must be in Gaza.
Unexploded or
unexploded.
Or partially exploded?
No. Unexploded ordnances. Yes. So that's the issue, is that for many years, this will be a very dangerous place.
Yeah, so I'm trying to formulate my question, because imperialism is okay, like this, this empires, they expand and whatever. But is it about capitalism at all?
Yeah. No, but there is
capitalism is about making money.
Yeah. Right. No, capitalism is part of the story, definitely. But there is another one. If you look at the case of Gaza, and then we can extend it to Russia in Ukraine, or to the UAE in Sudan, or to other actors in DRC. What is very important is that there are some political constituencies that support these wars. If you're a settler, and I encourage you to have a read about the typology of the settlers in Israel, they are generally the least educated members of the society. They have the less capital, and they have a vested interest in having the country taking over more land, so that then they can have free land, because they generally do not have a regular job. So they are, if you want, the quote-unquote misfits of the society. Some of them are not religious at all, some are, but generally what they have in common is that the only way for them to be able to live a decent life with something that they own, a flat or a house, is for them that it's on land taken. So colonization is one thing, but there is not just this ideology of making the state bigger and bigger. There is also this ideology that we're going to have subsidized land. Why? Because once the state has taken over Gaza, several ministers, in this case Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, will push for subsidized accommodations to be there. By the way, before 2005, this used to be the case. There were highly subsidized settlements in Gaza, and then they left. They left for a number of reasons. The White House, especially Condoleezza Rice, during the Bush years, was putting pressure, so she was the
Foreign Secretary of the US at that time, was putting pressure on Ariel Sharon for him to give concessions to the Palestinians, in exchange of which they would obtain other things. So he decided, okay, in Gaza, this community costs a lot, the water resources are almost exhausted, so their model of exporting flowers around the world will not work further, so let's move them into the West Bank. This is why it was left. But you still have people among the movements of the settlers, because there are different trends, etc., but you still have people who believe that they should have God-given land, but for them it's free land first and foremost, and in Gaza or in other places. And there is an economic incentive to do it. I mean, think about that. How much of your earnings in your life go into owning a place? And the studies in the OECD show that this is the main form of capital for household.
Well, that's from the private person's perspective, but for the state, the state, say the state of Israel or the state of Russia, they are spending so much money on all that, on this ordnance, and much more on everything.
Yeah.
They could, I don't know, they couldn't buy a piece of Greenland, of course, for that. So, like, because, one issue, of course, is that the world has been divided. So basically, having all the money of the world, you cannot do it. You cannot use this money for getting more land for a country.
Yeah.
That was the case, obviously, in the actual epoch of imperialism, not anymore.
It is. No, I totally agree. By the way, the state's action may seem to be economically irrational, but then at the level of politics, it may then be purely rational. For Benjamin Netanyahu to keep a coalition,
The level of electoral politics.
exactly. Then to keep a coalition intact, he needs the most far-right movements, including that of the settlers, to keep on voting for him, or at least for parties part of his coalition in the Knesset, the parliament, to be able to stay in power. And as long as he stays in power, especially if there is a war, then he doesn't have to attend his trial. Because again, in Tel Aviv, he has to attend his trial, and he's postponing it year after year. And by the way, there is a fantastic Israeli documentary which is called The Bibi Files. If you have the chance to watch it, it's a remarkable one that shows how, corrupt has been, Benjamin Netanyahu and his wife over the decades, and how the police had interviews of him being investigated leaked. And so this is very interesting to watch, because then you understand why he doesn't want to attend his trial at all and tries everything to postpone this via war.
More questions, please. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation, first of all. I have a bit of a abstract, I guess, question. So I was thinking that obviously there are numerous documented war crimes and ecological crimes in Ukraine right now, such as destruction of dam and large-scale mining of fields and whatnot. I can continue forever. But I was thinking about, my question is about the risk, because in the cases like occupation of Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, or the fact that there are actions that were being next to Chernobyl nuclear plant and whatever, we can see that there is a creation of potential massive, very, very large scale ecological disaster, even though it hasn't occurred yet. So
It has not occurred yet, you believe?
Not yet.
not yet.
Well, Kakhovka is not.
Yeah, no, I mean, but I'm talking more about like nuclear disaster, like of a huge scale, which would not influence only Ukrainians, obviously. Does this like deliberate creation of this risk, of this like existential environmental risk, would also be considered or like qualified for ecocide, or has it
should it already happen for it to be part of the framework?
Yes. Thank you for the question. This is for now, as you mentioned, for Zaporizhia, risk of ecocide in a very specific place. Many people are monitoring it very closely, including, of course, international organizations, because of the immense risk. Just the anecdote in the 1980s when Chernobyl had a nuclear reactor meltdown, and there was a nuclear or contaminated radioactive cloud that went across Europe, including over France. So the capacity of Chernobyl to affect the environments over very large areas is undeniable, undeniable. This is a major risk, and this is a major risk when we have policymakers such as Netanyahu or Putin or such figures, again, which show that they are ready for the sake of victory to go to lengths that most people would think are just unbelievable. It can be ruining their country, it can be destroying the reputation of their country, it can be inflicting economic destruction, etc. They will do it. Now, moving back to this, in Ukraine, yes, definitely there's been matters of ecocides that are under investigation. I remember a year and a half, and we were speaking about that just before the presentation, I was speaking with Ukrainian colleagues about this matter, and especially the targeting of energy infrastructure. Because there is definitely a policy in Russia that we cannot starve Ukraine, because this is a huge country with a lot of very fertile soils. They have support from the EU. It will be very difficult to starve them. But what we can do is that we can make their life unbearable during winter. And the easiest way to do so is to shut down power plants, including, if needed, nuclear plants. This is very risky. We've seen many cases of ecocide in the sense that, again, ecocide is not just about natural environments. It can be urban environments. And many of our cities are unlivable without electricity. So in hot countries, it's very obvious because they don't need heating, they need AC during summer. So if you go to Jakarta, Mumbai, or in Latin America, in Brazil, you'll find that, you suffocate if you don't have a minimum of cooling systems. But in the case of Ukraine, of course, if you don't have good, efficient heating systems, it's very, very dangerous.
Especially now when it's like minus 20 degrees.
Absolutely, absolutely. So yes, this is something which is considered, very interestingly, I mentioned this to a number of colleagues who at the beginning were dubious, because at the beginning they were thinking, no, they just randomly destroy everything. And I was saying, Putin is someone who is ready to go to great length again. I know Putin because I'm much older than you. In 1999, in the war against Chechnya, Putin besieged Grozny, so the capital city. And what he did is that then he let a column of forcibly displaced people move out and had this column bombed on the roads. So you can see already, I was speaking about the psychopath. By the way, the key characteristic of a psychopath is that he doesn't have empathy. It's just like it's not there. It's not one of his features. So with this kind of person, we can expect worse. And in that case, if he is able to have a movement of forcibly displaced people bombed, so families, first and foremost, just because there might be a few fighters in it, this is the kind of person who can really lead some Ukrainian regions to freeze. He will not care. In his mind, they will flee rather than freeze, but still, he can inflict grave, grave things, and we should not believe that there will be, logical, understandable reasons why he will refrain. He will not. That is Putin for the past now 27 years.
So we know him very well. And I remember back in the days when I was working for the French Ministry of Defense, people were not big fans of Putin, but I was one of those. I was working first and foremost on Georgia at that time for the French Ministry of Defense, raising the alarm saying, basically, look, this is a psychopath. He's in power. He believes that Russia should be great again, which to some extent for me is totally fine. That Russia is great again can be fine. You just don't invade countries to do it. You try to elevate the GDP per capita to do it, right? You go the Japanese way for it, or the Singaporean way for it, if you prefer. Fine. But you just don't colonialize or expand your empire. So to answer your question, I'm sorry for the long story behind it. I do believe that this is a major risk. This can be understood as ecocide because cities fully depend on it to be able to survive. And as such, urban ecosystems can be destroyed.
Thank you.
There was the last question somewhere. Yeah, please.
Thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I wanted to just make a quick comment about a slide about controlling the food entrance to Gaza. I wanted to add also several of the highest authorities in Israel has proudly announced how they have controlled the number of calories that has entered the siege in Gaza to control people. And I wanted to ask, I have read about how they have controlled the water, and now that they are expanding to some parts of Syria, it might be a new problem. Is it really a real problem, or?
Yes, so I think your colleague earlier on highlighted that in Gaza, much before 2023, there were already limitations to water. So there is a river, it's a small river, it's nothing by European or Asian standards, but by Middle East standards, it's a river, a wadi, so it's intermittent. Part of the year it works, part of the year it doesn't work. But there is a river which is called Wadi Gaza that starts in what is called the West Bank, Palestinian territories, and goes through Israeli territory and then into Gaza. But it's been dammed by the Israelis, so there is just a trickle that finds its way in Gaza, except when the Israelis decide to open the dam so that water flows. There is a whole literature, not just about Gaza, but in the world about dams being opened or not. Because generally, upstream countries have a different interest than downstream countries. So if, for instance, an upstream country produces electricity with a dam, it may release a lot of water when they need electricity, but it might be a season during which downstream they don't need water, or it can even flood because maybe there are already rains. Long story short, this happens. There are floodings that affect downstream Gaza, and some parts of the year there is restriction of the amount of water because they are not master of when there are these releases. So this is a key concern. And with regards to Syria, there is a part of the Middle East, especially Syria and Lebanon, they are considered the natural water tower, if you want, of the Middle East because they have mountains. So several of the rivers start there. And these are areas that are now under process of annexation by the state of Israel under Netanyahu. So a few years ago, Donald Trump recognized the Golan Heights as being annexed, but he's the only one, the US. The rest of the international community has not, the UN has not. But now Israel has gone further into Syria, as you know, and further into Lebanon. So they are taking over land which is rich in water, and it doesn't seem to be an accident. So I hope it answered your question.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.